Hi everyone, I'm Jake, and today I'm going to be making a skeleton. But not just any skeleton, a frustratingly tiny, approximately 1/50th scale skeleton. I have a couple of projects in mind that call for tiny skeletons, so I want to do a couple experiments to see what we can make. Before we begin though, it's time for math! Okay, so one good old American foot equals about 305 rest of the world millimeters. That means that at 1/50th scale, 1 scale foot is about 6 millimeters. Now let's get some proportions for this little guy. If we take a nice round 6 foot height, then our total skeleton height should be about 36 millimeters. Based on some lazy internet search about average human proportions, we want the head to be about 6 millimeters, which is actually more like a toddler's proportions, but I'm not going for realism here. What do you think this is, an anatomy class? No, I want a cartoony, whimsical skeleton. Each arm should be about 10 millimeters, each hand about 3, torso height should be about 15, I guess, and the legs should be about 15 too. The feet, I don't know, whatever looks good. Why do skeletons have so many parts? Our ribcage should be something like 10 millimeters wide, and that's our scale skeleton. I think when I was coming up with these numbers, I might have gotten a little unnecessarily detailed though. You'll see pretty soon that the height of the head, torso, legs, and arms were pretty good for reference, but a lot of the other little parts can really just be eyeballed at the end of the day.
Let's cut some wire.
I glued the shoulder width piece to the spine thinking that would help during the next step, but it really didn't. So if you're following my process, maybe skip that part. What did help was bending the wire into a nice pose that will reveal itself all in due time. I stuck all the pieces into this green foam thing I found in the trash and set it off to the side. The next thing I did was start covering my skeleton bits in Super Sculpey, and man, I don't know why I keep deciding to cover tiny intricate bits of wire in polymer clay. I must be a masochist. The fiddliness of this step combined with my over-caffeinated old man shaky shakes just ugh. I covered each arm and leg piece in an ever so tiny amount of clay. For this, the Super Sculpey worked pretty well as I was able to sort of scoosh the clay towards the ends of the wire and pick little pieces off to get a very thin layer of coverage. Next, I started working on the torso. Like I mentioned, I think gluing the shoulders onto the spine actually made this a little more difficult since the piece is so f***ing tiny. If I did it again, I would just sculpt the shoulders and ribcage directly on a straight piece of wire. Once I got the basic shape of the torso sculpted, I took a little detour to start working on the pelvis. This part was a bit of a struggle. I started trying to make the pelvis out of one piece of clay, but ended up going with 2 half pieces I could position later. And at this point, this is what he looked like. And now, probably the most iconic part of any skeleton, that spooky, spooky skull. For now, I just got the basic shape and scale. We'll come back later for some details. Look, it's smaller than my pinky nail. Next, I finished up the torso by adding some ribs and vertebrae, as well as just refining the shape and symmetry. Another moment where I regretted gluing the shoulder wire to the spine, as I think it came unglued inside the clay and I could feel it just kind of floating around in there as I worked. What is this? Ugh, cat hair. Approximately 3,654 hours later, I was satisfied with my torso and it was ready for a bake. So let's get this. Nope, that's not gonna work. Attempt 2. There we go. It's like a tiny pizza. Okay, back to the skull. We need a face. And at this point, I should mention my history of horrible clay choices. As I mentioned earlier, I used Super Sculpey for this entire project, which worked for most of the parts, but for the skull, it was almost impossible to keep the shape of that tiny ball of despair. I'd form one side, flip it over, and the other side was squished flat. I'd sculpt an eye and smush it as soon as I moved my finger. I mean, the thing is smaller than my pinky nail for Baphomet's sake. Eventually, I got something I was happy with, but I think this part of the skeleton might have been another good use case for a super stiff polymer clay like Sculpey Primo. If you have any tips for sculpting itty bitty bits like this with polymer clay, let me know in the comments as I'm pretty new to the medium. Once I finished the skull, I baked that as well. Now that my skeleton's skull and torso were burnt to a tiny crisp, I glued them together and I set to work finishing the limbs and the pelvis. This was a fairly straightforward task of adding those bony bits at the end. I decided to bake them and glue them on one at a time because, you know, reasons. I started with the arms, Then I glued on the pelvis. And finally, I glued on the legs. But even after all of this, I still wasn't done. I still needed some tiny hands and feet for this itty bitty bony boy. For this, I basically just rolled out the tiniest inedible clay spaghetti I could and made some skeletal extremities. One more round of baking and I could finally glue on the last pieces to my skeleton. And at long last, 18 years, 4 months, and 12 days later, my little tiny itty bitty, albeit burnt to a crisp, skeleton was looking pretty good. I mean, for a skeleton. It was time to paint this little guy. I started by priming it by hand and then realized, that's nice. Then, I just started layering paint from darker to lighter shades. The idea was to create a sort of gradient from the darker parts of the skeleton up to the surface of the bones. On something this small, not to mention this is an experiment, I wasn't super concerned about a ton of detail, just implied depth and negative space. I wanted my skeleton to look a little aged and dirty, so my color range started with a nice deep doo-doo and worked its way up to a pale yellow taco turd. I finished the paint job with a dry brush highlight of the lightest shade, but this was when disaster struck. My dry brush technique is apparently far too rough and I almost took his legs off, but a little super glue in the bum and a short wait and we were back on track. I finished my dry brush and when it was all painted up, I think this tiny skeleton came out pretty good. For the first time sculpting and painting an itty bitty skeleton smaller than my pinky finger, I'm super happy with the results. So what did we learn today? Well, I think next time I were to do this, I would use different clays for different parts of the skeleton. I think for the arms, the torso, the legs, even the hands and feet, the Super Sculpey worked pretty well, but for the skull and for the pelvis, those pieces I think really would have benefited from a harder clay like Sculpey Primo. I also think my armature could have been simplified a little bit. I had the shoulder span and the hip span, which I either didn't use or ended up actually getting in the way. I think just because of how small this thing was, they didn't add much value. So for the torso, I would definitely just sculpt a piece of clay on a straight piece of spinal wire and call it a day. But the legs and arms did help quite a bit in holding the pose and holding the shape of the skeleton. I also clearly need to soften my dry brush technique a little bit so that I don't take off any more skeleton legs in the future. And I have some ideas of how to actually make tiny skeletons better, a little more efficiently, probably just, this was an experiment, so I think I can do this better, and maybe I'll make some sort of itty bitty tiny skeleton series on the channel, so do the subscribe notification bell thing to see when I make the next one. But that's it for this project. I hope you liked it. If you did, leave a comment and a like. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.